So we're going to follow up with a bit of a roundtable discussion for a good 45 minutes, maybe a bit longer, depending on the time we have. And thinking, when we had to think about what to do the panel discussion about, and thank you for your talk, we had to think about what can we focus the panel discussion on. I mean, Gregg talked about norms, globally accepted norms. I think like the examples of the environment were very interesting. And during our discussions at CCRC to think about what should be the focus of the panel discussion, we not only noticed the difficulty with like thinking about globally accepted norms, but as well at the same time when we're seeing a fracturization of a balkanization of cyberspace. Like the original notion of what cyberspace was in the 90s seems to change. There's competing models of governance and management of how to use internet technologies and digital technologies. And this is one of the, I think, difficulties and things we want to address, oh, sorry, not me, the rest of the attendees, would address during the panel discussion about how can we achieve a common vision and commonly accepted norms when the basis of how we think about how to use this technology is already so different. I kindly like to invite the panelists on the stage. I'm going to start with my esteemed colleague, Professor Farber, Dave. Professor Farber is the co-director of the Cyber Civilization Research Center. He is a distinguished professor at Keio. If I'm correct, he has an appointment at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, among others. He is at Penn State, among others. I think most people... University of Pennsylvania, my apologies. I guess most people in this room will know Dave. Dave, have a seat. Dave is going to moderate. Then there is Jun Murai, who I introduced prior. I think I don't need to reintroduce him again. Then we're very happy to have Professor Watai here. Professor Watai, thank you for coming today. She's a professor of administrative law and a director of the LLM program at the Global Legal Practice at the Keio University Law School. And finally, but not least, Mr. Kajiura, who's the chair of the working group, thank you very much as well, on cybersecurity enhancement, the Committee on Cybersecurity at Keidanren, the Association of Japanese Business. He is as well a president at the Japan Cybersecurity Innovation, and a senior research at Hitachi. The floor is all yours, Dave. Take off and have fun.
Sorry. How about that? Switches. You might turn on your switches if you have. Not sure I can repeat myself, but I'll comment anyway. Questions. A key question that came up both in the talk and in the questions is, can you establish globally understood norms considering the differences in political structure, the competition between nation states, and the difficulties sometimes of identifying who's doing what? So I think I'd like to ask the panelists, in any order that you choose, let's start from our right, what their comments are on it. Would you like to?
Okay. Yeah. Probably I should go. I shall the discussion. Yeah. One of the things. I mean, by the way, Greg, thank you very much for the great talk in the other keynote. And yeah, one thing. Connecting with what he has mentioned, and then I agreed on the kind of overview of cyberspace and then the other things. But I want to emphasize one point that when we say global space, right, global cyberspace, then it's always a lot of things. I mean, your question about the kind of about who's going to be in the you said WTO. Okay, yeah, well, right. So those are the international organization, right? And so still international thing. And then when we are talking about the global space governance, then it's always, it's very likely based on an international relationship. And then the one thing we have to think about is internet is created and designed and then operated in a kind of non-international basis. So not the collection of the nations are responsible for operating it, and not the single nation is going to be responsible on that. So the other difficult situation, we've been facing it is coming from this space. So the internet space is truly global, and then operated, and then not a single nation state responsibility to run the space. That's a basic core part of the internet. And then we do have a lot of platform, like a web and everything. Still one web, and then web is not owned by a single entity, not a single company, single nation state. So this is also a truly global, I believe. And then other services on top of it. And then utilizing the internet, those services belong to the company, industries, and sometimes the government services. And then so it's a kind of a multiple architecture layer you mentioned of architecture which we need to understand. Then so the cybersecurity is of course technically coming from that kind of a global space, so because it's coming from the internet, and then the responsibility fall into each of the very likely each of the existing responsibility. Like the nation-to-nation warfare is a military national security responsibility on each of the nations or the group of nations, and then also the the business economic had a kind of rules among themselves, and then on the global space, and then they govern themselves. So the crimes is each nation's domestic issue, and then there is an Interpol and other international relationship among the police department, the police functions of each of the nation states. So those structures are a little bit complicated, but not that complicated. But we should. It's very likely that we sometimes forget those kind of architectural definition about the cyberspace and the real space. So that's probably should be clean, and then it's going to be beneficial certainly for the global health.
Thank you. I agree with Professor Murai. I think this is a matter of international law rather than domestic law. But since I'm a professor of administrative law, I would like to discuss this issue from a domestic perspective as well. So I think Japan could strengthen its domestic law, especially criminal law, amending it to be able to apply to cyber attacks. I mean, internationally permissible countermeasures to combat cyber attacks. We could have a provision like that in a criminal law system. However, the challenge cannot be met by domestic efforts alone. So international cooperation will be essential to a truly effective legal practice. But having said that, I think it will definitely take a lot of effort and time to come up with a new international law of cyber attack. There's still a lot to be discussed, and I think definition of cyber attack, cyber crime, and cyber warfare must be agreed upon in the first place. So in the meantime, I think we should try to promote regulatory convergence or regulatory coherence at the domestic level as well. I think it's happening today, but so we should try to come up with a minimum standard to deal with cyber attacks or the cyber warfare. Thank you.
申し訳ございません。私の方から産業界としてどう思っているかっていう話を今日はさせていただきたいと思います。ノームという言葉の範囲が非常に広いものですから、今第一のご質問はおそらく国際条約に近いようなその協定のことをおっしゃっていると思います。ラットレイさんのお話にもありましたが、本当にやるべきことっていうのは南極条約のようなものなんだろうなと思います。技術の発達によって今まで使えなかった空間が使えるようになった。そこで核実験をやるとか領有するとかそういう人たちが出てきた。それを南極条約で平和利用だと いうふうに決めた。こういうことを本来はサイバー空間でもやるべきだったというふうに考えています。ただ南極と違ってサイバー空間がそれが今すぐにできない理由は、もうすでにいろんな人がいっぱいいろんなことに使ってしまっていて、そういうレギュレートをするには手遅れだという理由だと思います。そこで現実には数年前にパリコールというものが出まして、産業界としてもその平和利用に向けた努力目標みたいな、そういうようなことですけれども、それには賛同した次第であります。ただあくまで努力目標であれば、そのやりたい放題のような人たちも出てくるわけで、これらをどうしていくか、村井先生がおっしゃったように、例えば犯罪に引き渡しどうするというような議論はこれから必要なのかなというふうに思ってございます。以上です。
Like to make any additional one? Okay. I'd like to raise an issue which is sort of buried in this, but as moderator, I take the right to change the questions. One of the issues that constantly comes up in the internet is privacy. It's probably the most contentious issue around, because every nation state seems to have a different definition of the rights of privacy of its citizens. The Europeans have GDPR, whatever the abbreviation is. The U.S. doesn't particularly like that. China has its own rules, and Japan has a constitutional right to privacy, which seems to be difficult at least for me to understand what its boundaries are. And so even on a very fundamental issue of what happens to personal information, we seem to have a complete disconnect in the sense. And to top it all off, the commercial sector, at least in the United States, where stock options are a very big part of the reward system, big companies tend to try to ignore the privacy rules if it enhances their bottom line. And one could argue maybe the public takes care of that, but they haven't shown a tendency to do that. How do we get around this problem?
You asked me for the hardest question anyway.
I know.
Okay. I understand that the privacy definition on a kind of social understanding are a little bit, different in any of the nation, state, or region, or whatever. Therefore, the agreement among themselves is very difficult to make. That's the point. And so we are basically talking about the services on top of the internet, right? And then the privacy is that one. And also another aspect. Well, that service privacy is going to be kind of more toward the domestic and the nation-state agreement and international regulation, because if the violation of the privacy can be kind of checked and policed and discussed under the domestic law by each of them, and then how that kind of global international service is going to be kind of controlled or regulated by each of the nation's law. So probably that's good. And then we do have a constitutional law in a different way, that the secrecy of a communication, which is applying to the more toward the basic communication players. And then so it's going to goes to the surveillance, and then how the communication experts going to be responsible on a kind of checking with the contents of the traffic type of a thing, which is a little bit complicated because it's going to touch into the infrastructure of the internet, and then that's going to be directly connecting to the how that continuation of the digital communication basics core infrastructure of the internet. So that is, if that is also the surveillance from the government, and including the, our constitutional law, number 21, is going to be considered as a part of the privacy. That's going to be a little bit different discussion than the more to the service one.
Anybody else have any comments on that? Please.
So, Dave, I think the question is, given different national approaches to privacy law and regulation, how do we solve it, right?
Yeah.
One could argue that this isn't something that you should or want to solve, but let me sort of take that a step and then back off of it. The fact that different nations, treat privacy differently is, sort of at a core sort of cultural value, right? So if you just take like the US and Europe, and then I'll probably go too far and try to characterize a Chinese perspective, right? But like in Europe, my experience is that Europeans are more comfortable with their data being in the hands of government and less comfortable with them being in the hands of corporations, and therefore, set up a data protection regime that, sort of inherently has those values, while in the US, at least till recently, I think we're in a change period in the US, it's the other way around. Like, we've been very suspicious of government holding of information, and we have Freedom of Information Acts, and we try to make sure that information doesn't unnecessarily flow to the government, have trusted corporations in general, if only because of our natural capitalist, inclinations in order to allow business and money to flow. My sense is in some Asian cultures, not just Chinese, because where I'm going to go is that there's regulations in a lot of countries where it's a more communal approach, again, that the government has a role in protecting society, and therefore inherently the government has the right to almost all the information. So what society gets from having different national data, protection regimes or privacy laws is a match to their culture. But what they give up, and this belies, I think, a cultural or a bias, is we give up the ability to cross borders easily,
yes, yeah.
right? And therefore, the connection to the global system is given up. Global corporations have a very difficult time operating environments, particularly technologically or data flow-wise, where the rules are different in different jurisdictions. So it's sort of a trade-off space. Again, having represented a global corporation in jurisdictions where the laws were you could not move data of a citizen across borders, that became very challenging, for the operations and the technology we set up. But I think it's a trade space, and the real value proposition is whether you're inherently think, the internet, the data that flows on it is sort of naturally a global resource and should be permitted to flow, or, you think that governments should be able to trump the global system by creating national approaches to it. So that's the way I see it.
Jun?
Yeah, one of the, issue about that kind of, service level, about data level privacy discussion, of course, there is a diversity about, and the cultural diversity and the legal diversity probably about the, how we treat the privacy issue. But now, the privacy from the personal data and then how to treat the personal data, that approach is going to be very much impacting the economy of the business now. And therefore, if the strict privacy regulation, then very likely that kind of AI type of the use of the private data, and then creating the new type of services, innovation, and other things, that going to be kind of decreasing. I mean, it's kind of balancing, trade-off type of a thing, right? Strong privacy regulations going to be a weakening the use of the private data, in a sense, right? So that's going to be a kind of a discussion, and the balancing, or the well understanding. The regulators should understand that the value of the private data and how it's going to be manipulated before using it. And then that kind of a discussion is probably going on, hopefully, in this country. And then so Keidanren is talking about the use of private data these days, and because many people say that Japan is behind in terms of using the private data, and that therefore that we are losing the global market thing. If that is the case, then probably more toward the kind of a sophisticated discussion is going to be necessary between the kind of legal people and the business people as well.
すみません。産業界としてはですね、今週、チリとニュージーランドとシンガポールがデータの流通、利用に関する新しい貿易協定を合意しそうだと。その中にデータの標準化とかそういうフローの非常に役に立つ話が入っているんですが、その中に GDPR に似た規約というのも入っていると聞いています。アメリカでもカリフォルニア州とかそういうレベルで似たようなことが制定化されていると聞いていて、大きな方向性としてはデファクトとしてはそちらの方向でいいだろうと。日本も日 EU EPA で、実質的に欧州の GDPR を容認したことになっています。我々が今一番悩んでいるのは、そのイノベーションをするために悩んでいるのは、どこまでが個人情報なんだっけというところがうまく説明できない。ドライバーの顔写真というのはそれはプライバシーデータですと。だからエンジンの回転数、これ多分違いますよね。だったらアクセルの角度ってどうですかというのをEU の担当官に聞くと5年間返事がないんです。ここをですね国際的な議論をしていきたいというふうに思っています。以上です。
Allow me to add just one thing. From the legal perspective, I think we can analyze this issue from the government in.
The microphone, yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe I should just bring this up. Okay. So the privacy issue, as we have already discussed, this freedom of speech issue. In this point, I think the government should not intervene or for example, broke the Twitter account or not let people see whatever they want to see over the internet. Otherwise, we will be trapped in the echo chamber, and what we hear is what the government wants us to hear. That's bad. So the government intervention should be refrained. But when we talk about data protection, I think government does have a responsibility to protect sensitive personal data of its citizens. In this case, the government intervention can be needed, and especially in the case of cyber attack.
Changing to maybe a more immediate thing, we're talking about potentially cyber conflicts. And one question I have here is, what legal framework can we apply to things like cyber attacks? The Hague Conventions, there are a lot of international conventions and laws. What type of structure should we try to achieve to control the extent of cyber conflicts? At what level? We have things which deal with chemical weapons, biological weapons. They can be very harmful, so can cyber weapons. And what's the structure of starting down that path, which is something I don't see happening?
The first one is, what constitutes a cyber war, right? And, the American position, and I think largely the Western position, has been don't create a new set of rules. Don't create a digital cyber Geneva cyber Geneva Convention. Just apply the existing set of law of armed conflict. For those who are really interested in this subject, there's something called the Tallinn Manual. A bunch of international lawyers have, now twice sort of tried to figure out how to apply existing international law Having worked this both as a government policy official and then a little bit on the private sector side, still pretty hard to sort out like what's an active war in cyberspace, right? And but there are, I think legal people tend to want to say we have to figure this out in other environments. Let's use the same thinking and logic about whether it's an act of aggression under the UN law or in a situation like NATO, has an armed attack. So it's to be lawyers talking about legal terms. The second thing you mentioned is sort of, should we have like arms control treaties or specific conventions to put certain things off limits? Again, the Russians proposed a cyber arms control treaty in 1998. So I think as my sort of observation, having been engaged in some of those discussions, is I think people started to figure out it was really much harder than like with chemical weapons or nuclear weapons, because the nature of code, the nature of the actual weapons in cyberspace is much harder to track, and therefore you couldn't do things like say you can only have 1,000, each side can only have 1,000 missiles. You can't have what's called force structure based agreements. That's why I think the thinking is moving towards norms and trying to keep off limits types of targets to be attacked, more like keep hospitals are not legitimate targets for for any war. Are there things like healthcare systems, financial systems, other areas that should be agreed upon because of the nature of geopolitics right now? The notion of a signed treaty, I think, is pretty hard, but this notion of norms, I think, is where the dialogue has gone.
I agree with Greg in terms of the warfare definition is existing already, and then even if that is utilizing the existing weapon or a different or a cyberspace weapon, and then it has to be identified as a warfare in the first, and then the warfare rules can apply once it was identified as a warfare. That's probably the way, and then but the difficult point about the cyberspace use of the kind of attacking somebody, and it's a very ambiguous that who's going to be attacking for what purposes. Is that the part of the war, or is that part of the personal individual action? And so that is difficult. And so if it's and also the same as a crime, and if identified as a crime, this is different. And then so the international crime relationship is going to be solving that issue. So it's always important that it's not respecting the existing rules and relationship for the warfare and the crime and in the international manner, and then utilizing the cyberspace technology is sometimes complex and difficult to identify. But we should identify that thing, and then so who's going to be doing that? So the warfare is usually done by a kind of military people, two militaries, right? Doing the warfare. But for the cyberspace attack, then they are not wearing the military uniform or anything. That's sometimes making things difficult. But also the weapon discussion, right? So the new way of kind of cyber attack, malware or whatever, then if the purpose to be used for the purpose of the warfare, then that's a weapon. But then if to be used for the different purposes, that's a kind of simply technology, right? So that's what I would like to answer to your question. So the respect the existing structure about the warfare, and then starting the discussion about identifying what's a special thing about the cyberspace.
Just an observation, 9/11, okay, an attack on a building, basically, which unfortunately killed a lot of people, but less than, I believe, the accidents, the deaths in the highway in a week or so, even less in the U.S. But the public pressure to react was basically started a war which was the United States is still in. And the question I would tend to ask here is, what will be the pressure from the public on a massive attack, for argument's sake, taking the Tokyo power system down? Okay, which could probably be done with enough exercise. Would the public demand retribution? I don't think we have, one of the observations we've made in the CCRC is we don't know. And in fact, we really don't know 9/11, what the real public impact was, pressure was. The administration had decided was going to be very high, and politically they had to respond. But these types of not knowing exactly what's involved there is, I think, a difficult issue. Do you agree, ma'am? Do you have a comment?
So it's hard to find the aggressor or wrongdoer. That makes it difficult.
Yes.
And I think the question here is, when would the attacked can exercise right to self-defense? And that is when cyber attack constitutes use of force. So I think we have to stick to law of armed conflict to decide what to attack and what not to attack. So as we know from the Tallinn manual, as Professor Rattray mentioned, so we will focus on the scale and effect of the attack to see whether that the cyber attack constitutes the use of force. So if the cyber attack causes physical destruction, like your example, such as other example could be causing a meltdown to the power plants, then legitimate targets such as military objectives of the aggressor can be attacked, I think. The victim state may respond forcefully in self-defense so long as doing so is consistent with the criteria of necessity and proportionality. And I think proportionality is most important in this sense.
Yeah, I could tend to agree there. Any comments, sir?
I guess they agree that we have actually pretty well-formed legal principles about this. My practical experience as a policymaker in the National Security Council is the decision that an attack is an act of war is inherently political. It's actually not legal. That we see all the time acts that could be considered acts of war that nations do not respond to because they just don't want to get into a conflict. And we see at times nations using things that probably fall below the threshold of things as excuses to conduct military action. So I just, because in cyberspace this is just even harder, right? Like, I guess I'll go back to your original question, Dave, which is, will we see a strong public pressure for retaliation or action if there's something highly disruptive? I think the answer is yes, right? Like, if it's clear that a cyber attack, made the power grid go out on the East Coast for a week and people died and, and the economy was massively disrupted, I think at least politicians will feel like the public demands retribution.
Would that be the same in Japan? And how much of it, one question that we keep raising is how much of this is cultural and how much is, politics is basically not an international norm. And that's something that, one of the things we'd like to understand better. What are the trigger points? I'm going to ask one final, from my perspective, I'm going off script, but I always do that. And that's the issue of two sub-issues. One is, I served on a Federal Communication Commission, which has the obligation to at least, they interpret it, to manage from a government perspective, the Internet's communications. under Title II or Title I, I forget which. They have jurisdiction on that. And yet nobody at that, when I was there, I was the only one who understood the internet at all. And that's close to the same now. Okay? It's just not understood. And so you're asking a group of people who really don't have a feel for what's involved to regulate it, which is a very dangerous game. The other question I had is, and it's a little orthogonal, there was a red phone in the courtesy of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I remember too much. It was terrifying experience. What's the equivalent when we're dealing with potentially escalatory cyber attacks in the future? How do we manage to get governments to rapidly communicate? And especially in an environment where I don't believe we have the technology to rapidly ascertain where the missile came from, the cyber missile came from. With regular missiles, you know where they came from. We have satellites that do that. It's considerably harder. Thank you. I can't buy glasses. Considerably harder to ascertain that. And I think that's another thing, putting preventive measures in place. And how do you do that? Interesting question there. Any thoughts, or is that just a good area for study?
I think hotlines are doable, right? The question is, will anybody pick them up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The U.S. and the Russians actually agreed to a cybersecurity hotline, and they don't use it, right? I mean, I actually don't know if it's still in existence, but I know the phones were put in. So, right, maybe the issue is we haven't had our Cuban Missile Crisis yet, and people are still more, like, those in the sort of national security realm are more concerned with protecting their secrets and what they could do and not giving anything away, and therefore don't want to communicate. I think that's dangerous, as the whole reason you have the cyber spring is that leaving this to chance with all these escalatory pressures could result in something disastrous very quickly. So again, my presentation sort of encouraged, like you just did, that we need to think about putting some of these things in place.
Okay, let me ask the panel if they have any questions to ask among themselves. I tried to cover a whole spectrum of stuff, but Jun?
Well, actually, the one thing I wanted to raise was that, include, we already discussed about the government involvement, and then, from the operation of the internet point of view, then, there is one, case study of a discussion happened in this country, and that was a violation of the copyright of manga contents, all right? Okay, and then, coming from the outside the country, and then, it's the economics went down from the sales of digital manga sales drastically went down. So the government, our government involved, and then blocked the internet. That was the order, initial order coming from the government, and so there was no regulation on that. Therefore, there was a committee, which was practically chaired by myself, and then start discussion with the legal people, and then is this the copyright violation, obviously, and then the blocking the internet, with basically the by DNS blocking thing. So that was a big discussion in this country, and so actually that is not happening yet, and so it's not stopped or changed or resulted anything, but then it's still potentially going there, but it's not. I mean, actually the person who's running the illegal sites outside the country, he was arrested. So but there is a new one coming in. So this is basically the commercial content right issue, and the government involved with blocking of the internet, which happened in the past in many cases. But so my question to the kind of the outside the country and also the legal expert, what the government regulation and in the future and other thoughts, and including date.
Let me make a comment, having just suffered from not copyright issues, but licensing issues. And when I came to Japan, now when I use Netflix, of course I can't access my U.S. Netflix unless I illegally go and synthesize myself as a U.S. site, which clearly violates some law. Do I expect anybody to come roaring after me? Not yet, but at some point in the game, people are going to get sensitive to that, in particular the license holders. And so what do? Do we, again, fracture the, you can watch that, but you can't watch that?
That is basically the commercial issue, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
commercial.
so the copyright control of business people.
Yeah.
I'm talking about how the government should
Reacts.
involved in that,
Yeah.
right? Because I think the Motion Picture Association, actually U.S., is very strictly controlling the border for the copyright, right?
And internally.
Right.
Under as I understand U.S. law, and I'm not a lawyer, I keep saying, that you can file essentially infringement and take down a site that violates copyright, I believe, in the U.S. fairly easily. Now, whether that's effective or not is a totally different issue. Okay, but in fact, it's being used the other way. Often, if you have a site which is doing perfectly legal stuff, but you would like to silence, you file a court document saying they're violating my copyrights. And you basically, they're obliged within a very short period of time to stop. And so you've essentially attacked the business and the freedom of speech of that person. It can be down at that level. It's a very complicated space. Government stays out of it. The courts stay in it because that's the function of the courts. But you can't go to the Federal Trade Commission or the FCC and yell. Right? You have to use the law that the Congress passed and try to figure out how to protect yourself. I'm going to thank the audience, the panel.
All right.
But not yet. We're going to open up to the audience for questions. We have some period of time, and if we don't get questions from the audience, I'll ask the panel if they have any things they'd like to talk about that are not covered by questions. Tobias?
I'll just speak loudly. So you had the whole discussion about like escalations and so on, right? I think this is both to the legal scholars and to Gregg as well. If you speak about an attack, to me it sounded a bit like you can actually pinpoint the attack. But like, for example, the WannaCry virus showed very clearly that there is a proliferation of like when something goes wrong. How can you even apply, for example, legal standards when there's all these unintended consequences that we can take care, what you cannot foresee? Like, maybe some dark irony is that when I launch a nuclear missile, I know where it's going to hit, and I know who's going to affect. But if a virus or like an attack comes out, it can easily proliferate from, let's say, hitting Ukraine and go from Ukraine to the UK to Germany to the US via South America. How can you legally then develop a framework that counters this? Like, would Germany say, hey, I'm suddenly unintendedly under attack? Is the attack, would it allow Germany or any other nation that's a secondary or third nation that is, as a result of the attack, is under attack, would it have the right to strike back or not? Because, the proportionality of the attack, I think, in cyberspace is a very difficult thing to pinpoint, right?
So I think, in my mind, you could make a pretty straightforward case that, with the things like WannaCry and not Petya, that it's the originators of the malware and the release of that is the malicious act. And the fact that it created, damage beyond the target should only amplify the action against the originator of the attack, right? So instead of it being a bilateral issue, like NotPetya is the one that I sort of focus on a little bit more, is like the Russians went after the Ukrainians and then the virus spread worldwide and caused a lot of damage. Well, if you can get to the attributions that it was originally a Russian attack and they unleashed something that was less controlled than they should have, that should only increase the sanctioning of the Russians. And the example that comes to mind to me, and maybe there is some room for agreement on this, is we are very scared of biological weapons, and it was easy to get a biological weapon convention because of the same thing. And that therefore, if one was to be the transgressor and released viruses, there should be clearer and more rapid and more vigorous international sanction for the release of such a situation.
Let me modify that a little bit. By the way, the first virus that was known to mankind, the Morris worm, was actually accidentally propagated. He didn't intend to do it. So, interesting case. The case law there was amusing. But the question I was going to ask is probably a more rational way to do it is to say the virus came from Russia. Whether it's government or not is a question, but there should be an obligation on the part of the government where the crime originated to prosecute that, and if they don't, there should be sanctions. And that's not the way we think of it now. If it came from Russia, it must be the Russian government. It's very difficult to know that. And yet I don't think we have any international treaty that does that. Yes, ma'am.
I think it goes back to your question, how do we manage government to quickly communicate? And my area of research is investment regulation from national security perspective. And the United States came up with a new law in 2018, and that law called for the establishment of a formal process for exchange of information between the United States and its allies. So it's been done in the area of investment regulation, and I think it could be done with cybersecurity too, cyber regulation as well.
Yeah, I once asked a American official when there was proposed treaty, and I said, there seems to be a uniform thing. He said, yeah, it's a great idea. Of course, we won't listen. We won't ratify it, right? And we have to somehow get countries to think of outside of their local commercial interests, which I think that one was. Very difficult. I think we just about had it. Is that correct?
Another till 4 o'clock, so you got another 8 minutes.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, Thomas Sullivan's my name. I just quickly wanted to ask you about the role that you think the United Nations could play with some of these cyber issues. Now, I noticed that the Secretary General of the United Nations this morning tweeted out his lists of the 4 risks of the apocalypse for the 21st century, and he mentioned the darker side of technology as being one. So I just kind of wanted to ask you specifically about the UN and as well with regard to non-state actors, and I guess maybe you've covered that in your last discussion. And I wanted to ask Kajiura-san as well. Obviously today Mitsubishi Electric, or yesterday, announced that they have been hacked, I guess, and they are a major supplier to the Japanese Ministry of Defense. So this is kind of very strategic for Japan. So I'd just like to ask you, how will Keidanren be reacting to this? What will your position be? Are you going to, for instance, the attack seems to have originated from China. So are you going to be contacting your counterparts in China to kind of discuss this? And thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。三菱電機さんの事件に関しては、まだ詳細も分かっておりませんし、細かいことは我々も把握をしておりません。ただ、そういうリスクがあることは以前から分かっていて、産業界としては、もう4年も前から、経団連という場でワーキングを作って、重要インフラをどう守る、重要インフラを直接支える企業をどう守るという議論をしてきています。で、その中で今一番ホットなことというのは、我々は攻撃を受けてもインダストリーとしては反撃というのは難しい。せいぜい、攻撃を検知してそれをデセプションという手段によって誤情報を流して攪乱するぐらいまでが多分産業界ができるカウンターアタックだと認識をしています。であればやるべきことは予防の一言に尽きるわけです。でしたがって今一番重要なツールと思っているのはインテリジェンスです。今中国という名前が出ましたが、その中国という国と日本という国、それから産業界そのもの、例えば私は日立グループの所属ですが、日立は10分の1の売り上げを中国で上げています。したがって、中国と今すぐ手切れするという選択肢はどんな経営者でもありえません。で、どうお付き合いをしていくかということに当然なりますけれども、各社の事情によってまず国と国との関係、自分の企業の立ち位置、そういうものを含めたインテリジェンスをどうやって経営者が認識すべきかと、今こういう啓発活動に努めているところでございます。直接的なお答えではないと思いますけれども、ギリギリまで答えさせていただきました。
I'll throw out a comment for, I've spent a fair amount of time when I was on the Internet Society board and over the years trying to understand this issue of the quote governance of the Internet, which I personally think is an oxymoron. I'm not sure you can govern it, you can manage it. And the UN has turned out to be a very difficult vehicle, mainly because of the way decisions are made. It's usually one nation, one vote, and many people believe that votes can be bought. There's some sign that that's probably true. So it's just turned out to be a very difficult environment to trust. That's basically it. Which did not be the case because it would be a really nice place to do it. But there has to be better behavior on the part of the way decisions are made.
And to sort of build on what Dave just said, as a globalist, I would be hopeful that the UN could make progress on creating, norms, rules. I think we haven't reached a point where the risks to all involved, the risks to the permanent five of the Security Council or to nations in general, has risen to the point where they're going to get effective collaboration there. I mean, just where the practical matter is, just this convening of the General Assembly last fall, the situation on the cyber issue is so fractured that the group of governmental experts process that have been in place for over a decade reconvened, and I think Japan's a member of the group, and because the Russians and the Chinese were so dissatisfied with how that group works, at the same time the General Assembly sanctioned another group where anybody can join. So the first group only has about 20 nations. It's felt to be controlled by the West. So separately, the General Assembly convened another group on the exact same subject. You can imagine that's not likely to get any sort of effective governance in place. And I think that inherently, as a practical matter, is the nature of the United Nations right now. It's just not a place where you can form sort of global governance policy.
Any other? Okay, Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, what I'd like to get the panelists to do is kind of follow the logic of some of this discussion and thinking, right? So we've talked about the difficulty of being able to regulate this issue. We've talked about the difficulty of these fitting neatly into the way our definitions work within law. We're in an environment where the UN is not working well, international cooperation is in decline. There is actually, like we're in a situation where we have norm decline rather than norm creation. The incentive structures are wrong, right? So Greg, to come back to the example you were giving about, the comparison with climate change, right? So we're like where we were with climate change 20 or 30 years ago, right? Nothing much has happened on climate change, right? We failed to get cooperation, we failed to get to seriously address climate change, and basically all the bad things which climate change scientists warned are now starting to happen, right? So what I would like to hear from the panelists is, if we go 10, 20 years in the future and we fail to get any type of cooperation, we fail to get norm setting, we fail to change incentives, what does this look like?
Jun?
One thing we need to think about is that, the cybersecurity is always, when the technology coming in and there is a abuse or maluse happening, and then that's what the cybersecurity is talking about. And then also we do have because it's a technology is changing and being advanced, year by year, day by day, maybe. So the advantages of the technology is also increasing, right? So the proper use and the ethical use, good use of the technology is increasing. So the benefit to the society and the people are increasing. That is a little bit different from the climate change situation, right? So the people get the benefit, economy got the growth, and the new things happening, and probably the saving the people's life and increasing their life of health and education and other things increasing. So that is a little bit different from your climate change analogy, right? And therefore, we see both of the things, and then the solutions to the cybersecurity issues we've been discussing about is also the I hope it's going to be improved because of this side of the improving the creation of the good part of the good use of a technology is going to be of course impacting to decrease the bad use of the technology, maluse of the technology. So that's how I think.
規範作りが失敗したらというそういうお話ですが、そう簡単に規範ができないのはよく分かっていますが、逆に考えてはどうでしょうか。新しい破壊的な技術が出てきた。例えばカンタムコンピューターが出てきて全ての暗号を一瞬に解いてしまうというようなこと、あるいは日本の総務省は 6G の話をすでに今週始めるということを言い出しました。まだ 5G も普及していないのになんだというのもあるんですが、そういうアドバンストテクノロジーが逆に社会そのものを変えてしまう。それはどっちに転ぶかは分からないわけです。いい方に転ぶか悪い方に転ぶかは分からないけれども、今の状態で、言葉を選ばずに言うと無理やり規範を作っても、それは10年後に別のテクノロジーによって、無意味にされてしまうかもしれない。ですから我々は今のテクノロジー、今の社会環境で精一杯は努力はするけれど、次の時代のことも予測して行動していかないといけない。それをやるのはまさにここに今おられる人たちではないかというふうに思います。
Decide how I want to answer the question because I tend to be a positivist, but Chris, I'm going to go with your logic, right? And as a realist, I actually think maybe I'll start with this. If we can't solve the environmental problem, we won't solve this one. And then I'm just going to go with your logic, right? So the more hopeful of the two futures, which isn't great, is that you see a very fractured internet, and you know that it's probably controlled. If governments can retain control, that you get disengagement, and there's a Chinese and maybe almost at a national level. But let's just say there's a Western and a non-Western internet. And I think you find cleaner enclaves and less clean enclaves. You see enclaves of these fractured internets or these fractured cyberspace environments where things are safer and easier to use and efficient, and then there's some messy interconnections between them, and there's illicit activity across enclaves, right? That's the better of the two futures, right? The worst of the two futures, which hopefully we'll avoid both with the environment and with the evolution of cyberspace, is I don't know how many people in here have read the William Gibson novel Neuromancer. So that's actually where the term cyberspace, and most people say it was defined. It's a mid-'80s science fiction novel. I seriously would do this, and the reason I'm probably in the room is a combination of that book and a book named by the Tofflers, because I started off as an intel officer working on nuclear weapons and thought the evolution of digital society was so important that I turned my academic and then my professional career to it. If you read Neuromancer, people are faster and smarter, computers are better, people spend more time in cyberspace, and it's the state of nature. Everybody's for themselves, crime is rampant, governments don't have control. So, you hope that motivates action to avoid that sort of situation, but again, progress on environmental warming isn't necessarily a good notion of how individuals, nations, and the global governance is going at the early stages of the 21st century.
Yeah, I tend to use as a potential nightmare model of 1984, Orwell's book. We're getting very, very close to that. In fact, in China, in New York City, for that matter, the huge number of surveillance cameras that I believe are computer controlled, because some of them are passive wide angle, some are very focused, is just a new image of 1984. All you need now is governments in place that recognize that gives them control. And I think what we have to do is, and this is really difficult, is have governments which take advantage of all the good things and suppress or at least postpone. California is trying to do that with their with the potential law limiting face recognition for 10 years, I think they said, to let it mature and understand what the public policy should be. I don't see that happening on a national basis in the U.S. In fact, my guess is they're going to go to the Supreme Court to overrule any law like that. But that's, you want to guard against both extremes. You want to take advantage of what's a very, very powerful mechanism, and you want to make sure that it doesn't all put us in chains. I think, sir, would you like to conclude?
I hope I can provide a bit of a more maybe positive note, otherwise to a gray ending of a Friday. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to panelists for... I think we can say we're off for a start of a constructive cyber dialogue, and I think it makes us wonder as well, in the meantime, between our next meeting, what we can think about what the topic is. As Professor Hobson mentioned, maybe we can start thinking about how we can develop not only collaborative pathways to secure the current ecosystem, but in the future as well, right? Because we still have a while to go, hopefully, even if climate change is not always on the way. I would kind of like to actually thank a few other people. This event would not be definitely not possible without the help of Cherry, who would... Thank you very much.
Yeah, we should also get the audience to understand the next one.
The next dialogue.
Yeah.
So...
with the
Yeah. So this is like, as I said in the beginning in the opening remarks earlier, it's the start of a dialogue that we're going to do with Gregg and Columbia University. So we're aiming to do the second dialogue round in New York in May, if everything works out. I mean, you're all cordially invited if you happen to be in New York. Feel free to join the public part of the event. We're going to think a bit long and hard about what we're going to talk about in May in between. So,
Though, Tobias, the other thing, which is actually probably appropriate, and I'd hope others participate, is part of the dialogue we want to make virtual or occur not by everybody flying across the Pacific Ocean. So hopefully by the end of March, we'll hold our first kickoff meeting, in a digital way, and hopefully people in the room will be able to participate, in that. And again, we want to make it sort of a more open and more frequent dialogue.
in light of the recent discussion on climate change, it might be good to start participating first on a digital level and save the climate a little bit. I think Dave wants to say something.
Oh, I'm just quite amazed that the internet's been around 35 years, and yet the use of video conferencing to hold meetings is still relatively immature. People have done much better than organizations like universities, especially in the United States. I can't talk for Asia, but in the United States, aside from the package income things, the ability to actually get multi-institutional institutions to collaborate on classes that are held in real time is close to zero, which I constantly kick ourselves for.
To close, I would like to give the floor to Professor Kokoro, who is the Vice President and a Professor at the Faculty of Policy Management, Graduate School of Media and Governance, who will close the symposium for us. Welcome.
No, I just I would like to deliver a few words of appreciation. So on behalf of entire Keio University, I'd like to extend my deepest appreciation for gathering today to discuss this very important topic. And of course, a very special thanks to Professor Gregg Rattray and Mr. Kajiura for taking time to come to Keio University for this event. The metaphor and the analogy of ecosystem, and particularly the swamp, has made me think a lot. Of course, in the swamp there are alligators, and I mean the diversity of participants in this ecosystem is so diverse. Of course, what's making the transparency lower are the microcosm organisms, and it's of course the swamp is affected by the other systems that's surrounding, including the global warming and whatnot. So. And how to, I mean, and then you talked about health. And when we come to think of it, do we really have common goal of what health is? I mean, is swamp healthy? For the alligators. Right. So really, I mean, I don't mean to start another conference. So my mission is to conclude it. But thank you for stimulating all these thoughts. I just want to mention that Keio, the KGRI, the institution that's hosting this event, is short for Keio University Global Research Institute, whose mission really is to be an active player in forming global collaboration in deeper thinking of global issues and action towards it. And of course, the Cyber Civilization Research Center, which is directly responsible for this event, will be thinking very deeply about cybersecurity and other critical issues surrounding the cyber world. And of course, let me also mention that Professor Farber and Professor Jun Murai are the co-directors. And for those of you who may be wondering that who knows Jun has reached his retirement age, the Keio University have decided that we should squeeze a little bit more out of Jun. And we decided to keep him as a distinguished professor. Yeah, distinguished. Professor of Keio University. And he will primarily be very active as a co-director of Cyber Civilization Research Center. So for those of you who want to get rid of him, I'm sorry he's staying. But of course, Professor Farber will be with us next year also. And we'll be starting a course. The CCRC is starting an educational course also with Dave and Tobias taking the initiative. So there is a lot coming up. And of course, collaboration with Columbia University is something that we very much look forward to. Together, I think we'll be able to provide not just between us, but be a resource to the rest of the world in managing this critically important and useful and yet dangerous technology that we have in hand. So we very much look forward to working with you, Gregg. And in that sense, I'm very much looking forward to working with all of you. So thank you very much, and good evening.